Welcome everyone to the Invasive Species Identification Training for the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge. My name is Catherine Shakey. I work for Homer Soil and Water Conservation District, and I coordinate the Kenai Peninsula Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area, also known as the KP-SISMA.
All right. Hi, folks. My name is Ben Wishnek. I'm the EDRR, or Early Detection Rapid Response Project Coordinator for the Fish and Wildlife Service for Southern Alaska, everywhere south of the Alaska Range, and based in Soldotna. I'm going to be doing the first part of the presentation, and then turning it over to Catherine, and then she's going to turn it back over to me at the end. So, all right, so a brief overview of the presentation. I'm going to talk about why we should care about invasive species, some general characteristics of invasive species. Then Catherine is going to talk about identification of plants, and then I'll touch on one of the marine invertebrates that we want to be looking out for. And then I'll finish off the presentation discussing how to report an invasive species sighting and then how to preserve samples for further identification. So why care about invasive species? The first big reason is the ecological impacts. A lot of the native species that are in our area aren't used to other species like invasive species, and when they do arrive, it can have a detrimental impact to the ecology of areas. Invasive species are also a refuge priority. Alaska Maritime has put a lot of effort into a biosecurity plan that I'm sure you guys are all very familiar with, that emphasizes prevention as the most cost-effective measure to prevent to protect our resources from invasive species. And additionally, only a small portion of the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge has been surveyed for invasive species. So you guys are our eyes and our ears out on the ground to help us try to find some more of them. And additionally, invasive species are also a regional priority for the Fish and Wildlife Service. This is part of Priority 1 in preparing for a changing climate in the region's 2017 strategic intent. So this is not only a refuge priority, but also something that the region is wanting us to start working on more. So some general characteristics of invasive species. They're most often found in disturbed areas like roadsides or gravel lots or areas where there's been construction, and then also after a disturbance. So a good example on the Kenai Peninsula close to you guys is the Swan Lake fire that occurred on the Kenai Refuge in 2019. There was a lot of concern about invasives coming in after that fire. And then also flooding. Japanese knotweed that's on the right of your screen there is a plant that's found in some riparian areas, and could potentially propagate more after a flooding event. So invasive species often reproduce rapidly, and there's a great amount of propagules or individuals produced. They have a great amount of mobility, so they can get to areas quicker than a lot of other species can, and they often grow quicker than a lot of other species do. So those characteristics allow them to flourish. So I will turn it over to Catherine now, and she'll talk about identification of some of the plants that you may occur when you're on the refuge.
Great, thanks, Ben. I'm just switching up our slide sharing here. Okay, catch up. So I wanted to point out that the goal of this presentation is to give you an introduction to the invasive and non-native plants that are a priority on the Kenai Peninsula and therefore most likely to hitch a ride over to the Maritime Refuge lands in South Central Alaska in general and Southeast Alaska. And it's tough to do a full botany lesson virtually this way. It's much better in the field. There are some really great resources to help you take this to the next level. And one of the most helpful publications I've found is the UAA Identification of Non-Native Plants in Alaska, which gives you a great introduction to botanical terms and parts of flowering plants and grasses, and has some more details about native lookalikes and non-native plants. So there's a hyperlink there at the bottom of the screen, and I recommend you check that out. Briefly, what I'm going to cover are some of the non-native flowering plants and grasses, as I mentioned, priorities for the Kenai Peninsula SYSMA and also on the most wanted and watch list. So I'll present these in the most aggressive to least aggressive order. There's an invasiveness ranking scale for the state of Alaska that is based on a plant's biology, its aggressiveness, its ability to outcompete native vegetation, its ecological impacts, and then the level of difficulty it requires to get rid of that plant or eradicate it. And then I'll also touch on the non-native plants that are recorded to be on maritime refuge lands and the plants that are at your warehouse where you store your equipment. You don't need to look at this list too extensively. I just wanted you to know that it exists. This is our priority plant list for the SYSMA. It is available on our website, kenainvasives.org, on the resources tab. It's part of our overarching strategic plan. The main thing I wanted to point out is we think about this in 3 different ways: primary concern, secondary concern, and potential invaders. The primary concern plants are those we think we can still eradicate from the Kenai Peninsula. This is, as Ben mentioned, the early detection and rapid response is the most cost-effective way to respond and control invasive species. The secondary concern plants, there's more established populations in different areas of the peninsula that are beyond eradication. So we are being careful to apply resources and efforts to satellite populations that either are directly threatening natural resources, salmon streams, or eradication is still feasible for a reasonable amount of funding and resources. And then the potential invaders. So because all of these plants are important to know and watch for out on refuge lands, I'm just going to kind of merge them all together and go through them from most aggressive to least aggressive. So to start off with, orange hawkweed, it's actually not the most aggressive, but it's the poster child for invasive plants on the Kenai Peninsula. Homer has quite a lot of orange hawkweed. There are not really any native plants that have orange flowers, especially ones in the aster family. And so if you see an orange aster, so the aster family plants have these slender petals or rays that come out, and they are prolific seed producers, often dispersed by wind. And yeah, if you see an orange flowering plant, chances are it's invasive. A few other characteristics of orange hawkweed: it has these basal leaves, so low to the ground, and notice it does not have leaves up and down the stem. Here's what we call a basal rosette. So all plants, when they merge, or when they first emerge in the spring, they usually have these basal rosettes, and then the flowering stalk will sprout from this. The leaves, the basal rosettes, and the stems and the involucral bracts, or the calx just below the petals, are all very hairy on orange hawkweed. All flowers, all plants in the Hericium genus have these extensive hairs. It makes them look quite fuzzy, actually. I also will mention that while you probably will not perfectly learn all these plants we're going to flash before you, one of the most important things is to get to know the native plants that are out there if you don't already. And if you see something that looks unusual or catches your eye, pay attention, figure out what it is. If there's a lot of it, if it's starting to create a monoculture, if it's in a disturbed site, all those characteristics that Ben just mentioned, chances are it might be an invasive plant. If there are a lot of them, it's worth taking a sample, and we'll touch on this a little bit later, but the the best way to take a sample of a plant is to get the full plant, the root system, the stem, flowers. If you can also get the seed stage, that's helpful because a lot of the mustard family plants are best identified using the characteristics of the seeds. One of the reasons orange hawkweed is so aggressive is because it reproduces in 3 ways: by rhizomes, so underground lateral roots that spread horizontally under the soil and sprout new plants. It also reproduces by stolons, these above ground runners, kind of like strawberries, that will then create a new plant. And then, of course, by seed that's distributed, hitching a ride on boots, equipment, fur, or distributed by wind. Recanary grass is one of the easier non-native grasses to identify, and it is widespread on the Kenai Peninsula. So it is possible that this plant could be out on the refuge lands, although it has not been recorded or documented as far as we know. It is a broadleaf grass. So there's only one other native broadleaf grass that is growing in Alaska, and that's the Beech Rye. I have a photo of that a little later. But this leaf can be, this blade can be up to 1 inch wide. This grass gets quite tall, and it can be over 6 feet tall, as you can see here. The seed heads go through a variety of stages. When they're flowering, they are quite open, and then when it converts to a seed, it tightens up into a tight panicle here. The other distinguishing characteristic of Recanary grass is that it stays green much later in the fall than native grasses, and so that can be a pretty easy way to allow it to catch your eye in August or September. One of the reasons it's so aggressive is that it can grow in dry soils, semi-aquatic soils, and fully submerged in water. The reason this is such a problem is because it can create these solid sod mats in wetlands, completely changing the hydrology, and it can also fill in shallow streams. So that is changing the hydrology that our salmon depend upon. I mentioned that the panicle goes through multiple stages. So that's the buds for the flowers here. They're nice and tight. And then when it actually flowers, it opens up. And then when it goes to seed, the panicle tightens back up again. The underground rhizomes of the Recanary grass can extend 9 feet in one season. So this plant is very aggressive in reproducing and very difficult to get rid of. It also has a transparent ligule, so that is the membrane that's between the leaf blade and the stem. There are native grasses that have transparent ligules as well, so this isn't the best indicator, or it's not the only indicator for identifying Recanary grass. This diagram on the right is more of a generic schematic, I guess, to teach you about different parts of grasses. So the main things I just wanted to point out here, the seed head at the top, and then the ligule between the blade and the stem. So that membrane that we're looking at, the ligule can be absent. It can also be hairy. And then where the blade attaches to the stem, there are also sometimes auricles that clasp around the stem. They're kind of like little ears that come around the stem. Sometimes it can be claw-like or rudimentary stubs or completely absent. In the case of Recanary grass, there are no auricles here. And then just another photo of Recanary grass. This is from the northern Kenai Peninsula up near Nikiski, Bishop's Creek. And the Recanary grass has not been treated here. It has now formed a monoculture on either side of the stream bank and is creeping into the middle of the stream and starting to really alter the hydrology that the salmon of that area, particularly coho, depend upon. A native look-alike, the Calamagrostis canadensis, or blue joint grass, is probably the easiest thing to confuse Recanary grass with. This native plant is much more slender. The leaves are thinner and they droop, excuse me, they droop a little off the stem. Also, the panicle of seed heads stays a little more open and the individual spikelets are more slender. So versus that tight spikelet that the Recanary grass has. Let's go back here. So there's the Recanary grass seed head versus the Calamagrostis seed head. Also, Calamagrostis will senesce. It will stop producing chlorophyll much earlier in the summer or in the fall than the Recanary grass will. So usually September and October is a good time to distinguish between the native and non-native. Another invasive grass is quack grass or Limus repens. This one is scattered in a few areas across the Kenai Peninsula, but so far we don't think that it's too widespread. It's a huge problem in rangeland in the lower 48 states. A couple of distinguishing characteristics. Its roots are quite strong and sharp, pointy on the end. These roots can break through really hard packed soil and even tubers of other plants. And then the leaves, actually I don't have a photo of it, but it has those auricles or those ears that are claw-like that come and clasp around the stem. And then the seed heads are, you can easily see the individual seeds. This is what many of you probably would associate with a typical wheat or rye seed head. The native plants that might be confused with it, these are other native plants in the Limus genus. The beech rye, which grows all over in Homer and coastal regions of Alaska, it's our other wide-leaved grass that we have, so it can have about an inch wide leaf as well. The seed head is quite long. You can see the comparison to the hand there. It can be 6 inches long and quite thick. The slender wheatgrass, there's actually a variety of this grass that the Plant Material Center in Palmer produces for state projects, and DOT, for instance, uses it for revegetation along highways. So you will actually find this native Limus species growing in a lot of roadsides. All right, shifting back to flowering plants. White sweet clover is a very aggressive non-native plant that has taken over much of interior Alaska and South Central. We have managed to keep it down to under 15 populations on the whole Kenai Peninsula and are actively working on eradicating it. It is a member of the pea family or legume, and it fixes nitrogen. So all members of the pea family fix nitrogen. That gives it a competitive edge, especially in soil poor environments. A lot of the plants that we have up in Alaska are adapted to survive in poor nutrient soils. So if a plant that can fix its own nitrogen comes in, it really has a competitive edge. It's also changing the soil chemistry, which means that those other native plants may not have as much of an advantage as they used to have. There are some extensive studies that have come out of Fairbanks, Dr. Katie Spellman, about pollinator habitat and white sweet clover specifically, because you can just see, I should also mention this plant can be 6 feet tall, quite a large, tall plant. And there's so many flowers, small flowers up and down the stems that it has a lot of nectar in there. So it attracts a lot of native pollinators to it and away from native plants. So it's a disruptor of pollinator patterns. The other thing I wanted to mention is that all flowers in the pea family have irregular petals. So there are usually 2 different sizes on the top and the bottom petals. And then there's this keel that kind of juts out underneath. And the petals on the white sweet clover, here's a good comparison with the hand. You can see we have yellow and white sweet clover, and the flowers are quite small and slender, and then the leaves are also quite small and slender. They can be pretty round to a little more lanceolate, but they are in groups of 3, and the leaves are slightly serrated. But here's a good landscape shot, and you can kind of see the flowers aren't super distinct from a distance, but it really creates a monoculture quite quickly. Canada thistle or creeping thistle and bull thistle are 2 thistles that we really need to keep an eye out for, super aggressive plants. The creeping thistle is a little more common, but we only have about 5 infestations on the whole Kenai Peninsula that we know of, and we're actively treating those. They can get over to 6 feet tall as well. They don't have nearly as many spines up and down the stem as the bull thistle has. You can see there are spines up and down the stem, and then on the calyx of the flower. Excuse me. Distinguishing characteristic of the thistle flowers is that they lack petals. Instead, they have kind of these spiky flowers, and they can range in color from purple, pink, to kind of this white color. These are all photos of creeping thistle. You can see how they just fill in a field. They're toxic to grazing animals. And then the root system is just really extensive, lots of rhizomes down there. And then the basal rosettes, growing up in Minnesota, I certainly remember running barefoot across some of these and it making me yelp. So we don't have native thistles in Alaska. So if you see something like this, you should definitely report it to the refuge. Bird vetch, so another member of the pea family, and there are a lot of native vetches and legumes in Alaska, but they behave differently than bird vetch. Bird vetch is an aggressive climber up and over other vegetation, and it does have, there are several native lookalikes though. So in general, the vetches have these long stems with pinnate alternate leaves. So you can see that these leaves are the same size, they're long and narrow on either side of the stem. And then the bird vetch has a nice cluster of flowers up and down the stem. Give you another size comparison. This is what happened in Fairbanks. We don't like to talk about it too much, but it's a good comparison of how tiny those leaves are, and the flowers, you know, they can be about the length of your finger. And here's a picture from up in Soldotna or Sterling. You can see how the bird vetch is just climbing up and over the spruce tree. Some native lookalikes. So the marsh pea, the leaves look very similar, you know, long and slender on either side of the plant, but it has wings. So the stem kind of has tissue that expands and flares out on either side versus the bird vetch, which is just a completely cylindrical stem. The flowers are also different. There's just a couple of flowers rather than a full raceme of flowers. And then the marsh pea here on the right, this is up and down the Homer spit, and it is a native plant. It has much rounder leaves rather than those lanceolate long narrow leaves. The European bird cherry or choke cherry, also called the Mayday tree, these were widely planted as ornamentals all over Alaska for the last 30 years, and they've escaped and are toxic to moose and changing insect compositions along salmon streams. They have these tart little cherries that are formed in the fall, and the birds really love them, and they transport them usually about 500 feet from a mother tree, but they can bring them as far as 4 miles, it's been shown. I'm not sure you will encounter this anywhere on refuge lands, but if there are some residential areas where people have been experimenting with planting ornamental trees, you might come across it. Certainly on the Kenai Peninsula and in South Central and in Talkeetna and in Fairbanks, it has started to create these jungly shoots where it's just completely taking over the understory of the boreal forest. Back to, well, okay, this is the beginning of a lot of yellow non-native flowers. And I think with a lot of these yellow asters, you are going to need to take a sample and send them to an expert, myself or someone else at the Maritime Refuge, or UAA's herbarium. They're great at confirming identification of plants and getting back to you. This is one of the most enjoyable parts of our jobs. So the perennial sow thistle can be quite tall, over 6 feet. It has a milky sap inside the hollow stems, and the leaves are reduced as you go up the stem. You can see there are very few leaves, but there are more lower down on the stem, and then the basal leaves can look like this. There's a lot of variability in what these leaves can look like. I found some that actually were quite lobed and semi-serrated last year here in Homer, but that's the only infestation I know of on the Kenai Peninsula. So if this is showing up, it's probably the seeds are hitching a ride on equipment or boots to get out to the islands. Yellow toad flax, also called butter and eggs. This is a common residential weed found in gardens and yards. It has a really extensive rhizomatic root system underground that will sprout new plants. The leaves are very slender, smooth, and pointy, all up and down the stem. The flowers, the spur at the top here can be about 1 to 1.5 inches long, and there can be quite a variability in how orange this center of the petal looks, depending. They can be light yellow to darker yellow in color. Buttercups, there are, the ranunculus family is quite large, and there are a lot of native ranunculus species. Your monkshood, your larkspurs, delphiniums, they're all in the ranunculus ranunculus family. We also have a lot of native, well, not a lot, but a handful of native buttercups whose flowers can look very much like the non-native invasive buttercups. So you're going to need to be careful with identification of these. A couple of distinguishing factors: the tall buttercup can get quite tall. 5 feet is as tall as I've seen it, usually more 2 to 3 feet tall. And the upper part of the stem really shoots above the rest of the plant. The leaves are very lobed. They look a lot like monkshood leaves, if you're familiar with that, or other delphinium leaves, which makes sense. They're all in the same family. Versus the creeping buttercup, which stays very low to the ground, usually not more than 4 to 6 inches tall. The leaves are palmate and they have lobes of 3, and there are often white or silvery spots on those leaves, although it doesn't have to have those. So here's a look at the ground cover leaf structure there. However, you'll notice that the flowers look almost identical. Going back to those characteristics that Ben mentioned earlier, if you're seeing a lot of buttercup in disturbed sites, they're reproducing quite quickly and outcompeting native plants, then you might have an invasive buttercup infestation. Tansy Regwort, this is a common one in the lower 48 and rangelands. It's actually an annual. Most of the plants I've been talking about are perennials. But the basal leaf is very lobed up and down entire stem. And it does have leaves up and down the stem, although they get reduced as you get towards the flowers. Fewer petals or rays coming out of the flower. And another toxic plant. There aren't too many infestations I know of this around the state, but it is certainly known to exist. So something to keep an eye out for. The yellow hawkweed, so remember orange hawkweed is a Hericium genus, and the yellow Hericiums can range from just a couple of inches tall to a couple of feet tall. So caspitosum, or the meadow hawkweed, gets quite tall, and again, you can see all those hairs up and down the leaves and up and down the stems. In general, the hawkweed leaves are smooth and lanceolate in shape, and they kind of flare out and get larger at the end. And you can see this is what happens if you let those Hericium species go and don't respond to them. They're quite aggressive. And not only does this outcompete native vegetation, alter pollinator habitat, but it also is, it's impeding the ecosystem's ability to follow its normal course of succession. So the secondary plants and shrubs to move in. I should also mention that the Hericium species and a lot of these non-native plants are allelopathic, which means that they have hormones they release through their root system or sometimes through their pollen that inhibits the growth of other plants. So they have that extra weapon that they're using too. Mouse ear hawkweed, a pretty short Hericium, but again, that basal rosette is pretty hairy. And if you just look at how these rosettes are stacked on top of each other, they, especially if you mow them, they will put a lot more energy into their vegetative lateral growth. And so those basal rosettes just stack on top of one another, and there's no room for other plants to emerge. And then the narrow leaf hawkweed undulatum. This one's taken off a lot in the last couple of years across the Kenai Peninsula, up and down the highway in Sterling. But again, it does have those hairs, although it's not nearly as hairy on the stem and the calyx of the flower as the orange hawkweed or the meadow hawkweed. Common tansy, this one was introduced as an ornamental originally. It can get quite tall, 4 feet, sometimes 5 feet, and it has really dark leaves that to a lot of folks look fern-like. There are no petals. The flowers look like little buttons, and it's very aromatic and pungent. You can smell it. You don't have to get very close to smell it. If this is out on maritime refuge lands, it's probably because it was introduced as an ornamental, and it's best to get it out of there as soon as possible. In residential areas, I should say, or communities. Creepus tectorum, this flower is is more widespread in interior Alaska, especially in the hayfields around Salta Delta, Fairbanks region. It's usually about 3 feet tall, and it has not a lot of leaves. It has these kind of narrow lobed leaves at the base, but then they're really reduced and absent as you climb up the stem. And yeah, it also has a white milky juice inside if you were to break open the stem. Fall dandelion or autumn hawkbit, we just call this one Leontodon autumnalis to distinguish it from the common dandelion. You can see that from a distance, it can look a lot like the common dandelion. It's about the same height, about a foot tall, but its leaf structure is very different. Long, narrow leaves that have very distinct lobes and slender points coming off. And the flowers are also, they look more like the other non-native Hericium species flowers in that there aren't as many petals. They're not as dense. The rays aren't as dense as the common dandelion. This one is just ranked about 51, I think, on the invasiveness scale. Remember, that's a scale of 0 to 100. If you're above 60, then I start to really pay close attention because those plants can invade native boreal forest and native ecosystems here in Alaska. However, plants that are modestly to weakly invasive might still have dramatic impacts on the Maritime Refuge Islands because those are sensitive habitats with low biodiversity and not as many plants to compete and fight off those invaders. There are a handful of non-native daisies, and there are also a couple of native daisies. So I just wanted to touch briefly on two of the most common invasive ones. The Lycanthum vulgari or oxide daisy is here on the left, and then the scentless false mayweed is on the right. The flowers look almost identical. They're about 1.5 inches in diameter, and the leaves are the key here. So you can see these leaves are kind of spidery, very thin, whereas the leaves of the oxide daisy are thicker. There's a little more substance to them. Close up again here. So the oxide daisy, they have serrated leaves. They're dark green, although the level of green can really vary quite a bit. And both of these plants can grow between 1 foot to 2.5 feet tall, sometimes 3 feet probably for the oxide daisy. And again, the scentless chamomile, much narrow, spidery-like leaves. There is a scented chamomile that's non-native as well. But again, with these, it's probably best just if you don't know to take a sample and send it in. Unless there's only one plant that's growing out in an undisturbed alpine meadow, chances are it's probably a native aster or native daisy. Hemp nettle, I imagine many of you are familiar with this. It can look a little like stinging nettle from a distance, but these spines actually don't sting the same way that stinging nettle does. Certainly they'll itch and irritate your skin, but they're not nearly as, they don't break off and have the toxin like the stinging nettle does. Galeopsis tetrahit, it is common in gardens, yards, gravel, fill material. It usually gets shaded out and outcompeted by native species, but again, the refuge islands might be more vulnerable than boreal forest here on the Kenai. And small purple flowers. All right, I'm going to hit briefly on the Kenai Peninsula most wanted list or watch list. These are ones you want to keep an eye out for. Japanese knotweed, Ben mentioned that earlier. Garlic mustard, this one is widespread in the Pacific Northwest and quite aggressive on trail systems, so we really want to keep this one out. The spotted knapweeds, we've managed to keep those off of the Kenai Peninsula, knapweeds in general. I already mentioned Tansy Regwort, but ornamental jewelweed and purple loosestrife were both introduced as ornamentals originally and can spread quite quickly. So a little more detail. Sorry for this fuzzy photo here, but I just wanted to give the size comparison to you. Japanese knotweed can get huge, and it basically forms a thick, dense shrub barrier. The flowers are pretty small and indistinct. The leaves are round and quite plump, and the roots are really difficult to get rid of. Spotted knapweed, there are many species of knapweeds, and in general, they have these long, slender petals that kind of flare out to the side and these inflated calyxes below the petals. Not very obvious leaves, just short little lanceolate leaves up and down the stems. You can hardly see the plant in this photo, but there are little pink splotches throughout that rangeland. And when it's not flowering, the vegetative growth can just look kind of indistinct. But we don't have many native plants that look like this plant in general. The way the vegetation growth and the stems kind of flare out with those tiny leaves up and down. So here's the meadow knotweed, which is a hybrid of the brown and black knotweed. Again, you can see that inflated calyx, and these bracts are actually very different from the flower and more brown instead of green. So anyway, if you see anything that looks remotely like this, it's worth investigating and checking out because these aggressively take over grasslands. Purple loosestrife has between 5 to 7 petals that are kind of wrinkly and spread out. It can get quite tall, 4 feet, 6 feet tall, and a long raceme of flowers at the top. This is what happens to wetlands. It really likes those wet environments in the Midwest. It's really taken over. And the leaves are lanceolate, so long and narrow, and either alternate on either side of the stem or in whorls, which means they kind of rotate around. Their position on the stem rotates and spins as you move. Wild buckwheat or black bindweed. We have a lot of plants, native plants in Alaska that are in the Polygonum genus. However, we don't have any that behave like this, like the creeping, vining plants. And this arrowhead leaf is very distinct about it, as well as the flowers are indistinct, but that is a defining characteristic of it that can help you identify it. Cheatgrass is certainly an invasive grass we do not want in Alaska. It alters fire regimes pretty dramatically. It sucks up a lot of moisture from the soil, especially because it has a fibrous root system that can grow a lot in the winter. And the seed heads are nodding, and they also, these individual spikelets can be about 1 to 1.5 inches long. There are some fine hairs that are on the base of the blades of grass. And this is usually about 1 foot to 2 feet tall. Scotch broom, if you've driven up and down the Pacific Northwest coast, you've probably seen this plant. It was originally introduced as an ornamental and then introduced for controlling erosion, but it has spread like wildfire. It's a member of the pea family, so it has that irregular flower with different sized and shaped petals. And then when this one goes to seed, it really does look like a pea. You can see the pea pod there. This gets really tall, very shrub-like. We don't have anything that looks like this that's native. Another non-native is the gorse, which can look very similar to Scotch broom, but it has pretty gnarly thorns up and down the stem. And Himalayan Blackberry, I imagine many of you who have traveled through the lower 48 have seen this, especially in Washington and Oregon and Northern California. This is just a really brambly, viney berry that just takes over the understory of forests. We do not want this in Alaska. Our native berry shrubs like salmonberry don't have these gnarly thorns and form such thick brackets that are impossible to walk through the way that Himalayan blackberry behaves. If this is going to show up in Alaska, it's probably going to arrive because someone intentionally plants it and introduces it. All right, I'm going to touch briefly on the non-native plants recorded on the refuge, and Rosa Rigosa is one of them that I noticed I haven't touched on yet. The native rose that we have in Alaska does not have as many petals. You can see the Rosa Rigosa has lots of layers of petals here. When it's very open, it's not as obvious, but there still are a couple of layers of petals. The native rose just has, I think it's 5 simple petals. Also, the rose hip on Rosa Rigosa is quite large. It's about 3 times the size of the native rose, which is much smaller. And in general, this plant is more shrub-like. It's been ranked pretty high on the invasiveness scale, although that has been debated if it's actually as aggressive as it's ranked. It doesn't seem to be, while it spreads, it doesn't seem to spread quite as fast as some of the other invasives. So this was a list that was provided to us of non-native plants known on the refuge at this point in time. So I clipped out the highly invasive to moderately invasive. We've covered most of the plants on this list already. I didn't get into the tall fescue just because we don't have time to get into grasses very much during this presentation. And then here's a list of the modestly invasive, so ranked between 59 and 50. Again, I'm not as concerned about these plants here on the Kenai Peninsula as far as protecting native habitat. However, they might be a problem out on the refuge when you have pristine alpine meadows, they could do some damage and take over and create monocultures. Or in the case of common dandelion, we're worried about it hybridizing with native dandelion species because, you know, once you hybridize, you get the benefit of both the native edge and the invasive characteristics that can really allow a plant to take off and create a monoculture. So I'm not going to touch on a lot of these. A lot of the mustards and the grasses, it's best if you see something that seems like it's growing in an area where it was probably introduced by human activity, best to take a sample and send it in. And management and response actions are really going to vary depending on the plant and the characteristics of the plant and the site that it's growing in. More of the weakly to very weakly invasive. So these are ranked lower, more of your common garden weeds, chickweed, and several chickweed species, plantain, annual bluegrass. So now I'm just going to touch on the warehouse non-native plants. There's a lot of the Leontodon autumnalis, or the fall dandelion, growing along the warehouse. And this one is not on the list of refuge lands, but if it does show up, we are going to want to eradicate that one. Pineapple weed, timothy grass, common plantain, chickweed, common dandelion, and white clover. These are all the non-native plants growing where you store your equipment and at the entrance of the building. So we have worked with the Maritime Refuge to create an integrated pest management plan for controlling those plants. Here's some pictures. I'm sure a lot of you recognize these. The pineapple weed's pretty short, doesn't get, well, most of these don't get taller than 4 to 6 inches. Common plantain, there are some native plantain species, but again, think about where is this plant growing? Is it in a disturbed area? And then common chickweed here. We do have quite a few native chickweeds, so this flower should look familiar to you if you're paying attention to the wildflowers out there. However, the rate at which non-native chickweeds will spread and create a solid mat is different than the native chickweeds. They're usually more dispersed throughout the landscape. Timothy grass is planted all over the Kenai Peninsula for hay fields, and so it's not a surprise that it's been found out on the Maritime Refuge. It has this short spikelet at the top, and when it's mowed, it actually also can sometimes, it tricks me a little bit with the Recanary grass in October because it can still be green. And while the leaves aren't super wide, there can be a lot of variability in the width of the Recanary grass leaves, so sometimes it's confusing. White clover, very different than that tall white sweet clover or yellow clover. This is a ground cover. It's often planted as a crop cover because they fix nitrogen. It's in the pea family. But again, it can alter soil chemistry and can inhibit native plant growth. And then the common dandelion versus the native dandelion, I just wanted to point out a couple of key characteristics and give you some resources to investigate this further on your own. First off, the University of Alaska Anchorage has some great biology sheets. If you go to if you Google EPIC, so EPIC stands for Exotic Plant Inventory Clearinghouse, it will send you to a comprehensive list of non-native plants found in Alaska, and there are biology sheets that look like this, and will give you specific descriptions of the plant, ecological impacts, distribution, and control options. So super helpful resource. In general, we talk about involucral bracts, and the non-native bracts tend to be light green, long and narrow, and they will bend away from the calyx over time, whereas the, and here again is another picture of the non-native dandelion with those bracts bending away versus a native species that stays upright. Those bracts are nice and tight. So something you can keep an eye out for when you're out there trying to identify dandelions. I didn't want to go through this whole presentation without at least touching on an aquatic invasive plant. This probably is not super relevant for the Maritime Refuge, but there are a few lakes out there, and if there's floatplane traffic, you're at risk of getting Alodia introduced. This is the first aquatic invasive plant in Alaska, and it has leaves that are about 1 centimeter long, and they're in whorls of 3 up and down the stem. So pretty tiny leaves, and here's a good rake sample of it. One little fragment introduced to a lake can clone itself and fill in the entire lake quite quickly, altering the chemistry of the water, the oxygen content, and impacting our salmon, as well as just being a pain for those trying to recreate on the lake and reducing property values. And here's a map of floatplane traffic across the state. So you can see, I figured it was relevant to include this because of the traffic out on the Aleutians there. And the Stop Aquatic Hitchhikers campaign is the best message to share, which is clean, drain, and dry your boats, your planes, your fishing gear before moving from one lake to another, no matter what. Okay, and with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass it back over to Ben.
All right, thanks, Catherine. I will round out the presentation starting now. Although we've talked about plants for the majority of the presentation, there is one critter that's not a plant that poses a pretty serious threat to some of the estuarine environments in Alaska, and that is the European green crab. It's currently not found in Alaska, but it's been identified less than 90 miles from the border with Alaska in southeast. So it's on the way up, and just like Catherine mentioned with the Lodia before, there's a lot of connectivity via ship traffic to ports along the Aleutian chain with areas in the lower 48 where the green crab is found. So if you're out and have some extra time and walk on the beach and want to start looking at crabs, this is a good one to keep your eye out for. Some distinguishing characteristics of the crab. It has five triangular teeth and spines on the carapace margins, as seen here between the eyes and the widest part of the shell. It also has these three smaller rounded bumps between the eyes. It's not nearly as big as some of the other native crabs that are pretty commercially important. But its carapace length here can be about 2.5 to 4 inches. And then, although it's called the European green crab, its color can be pretty variable. It can be dark olive green to brown and gray. But this guy poses a threat to some of the estuarine the systems in Alaska. It can burrow in banks and destabilize the banks, and then also destabilize a lot of the eelgrass beds that are found along the Alaska Peninsula that are very important to a migratory water birds like the black brant. So some more resources for identification. The Kenai Sisma Invasives website has the AIA page with all the species and more information about some of them that you can go read about. And then also the KP Sisma has a YouTube channel, and there are a lot of different presentations and recordings up there on a whole host of different topics about invasive species, not just plants, that you can make yourself familiar with, just to make sure that you're helping us be an extra set of eyes and ears on the ground to keep appraised of any new invasives we have. One other the item that Catherine mentioned towards the beginning of the presentation is this publication, the identification of non-native plants in Alaska. We've got a link on the presentation here, and so we can send that out to Refuge staff, or if you need a link to that or any of these other items, please feel free to contact us and we can get you that information. So when you guys are out in the field, one big thing that we're asking you to do is help us report invasive species, and there are multiple ways that you can do that. One of the first ones would be to call the 1877 invasive number. That's a number that goes right to the state, and that's a great place to report all invasives, whether it's an animal, a fish, a plant, or an insect. Um, that's 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 one way to report. You can also use the ADF&G online reporter. That's another tool. There's a link here, and then there's a cooperative extension pest reporter as well. So you can use any of these tools, and this is taken from the Kenai Invasives website. So you can go there to find these links. And then one other report, whichever one of these you want to choose to report, whether it's one of them or three of them. You also want to make sure to inform refuge management, so they can start to figure out kind of what management decisions they want to make about that species. So some other useful tools that you can use. There's the Alaska Weeds ID app, where you can learn to identify and report some of the most harmful species, including some of the ones that Catherine touched on earlier, and using this app. And it's something that can be done without cell coverage, so it's like a virtual field guide that you guys can take with you. There's also the certified weed-free gravel program, which is something to be useful to keep in mind. This is a program that promotes keeping gravel and native seed mix and hay free of invasive species. So if you're interested in that program, you can go to the Kenai Invasives website and click on the link here for that. And then a final program is the Play Clean Go program. It's the three basic words that are pretty easy to abide by. You go out and you play, you do whatever recreation you want to do, or in your case, work, which can often feel like recreation because we're so lucky to have these jobs where we can work in amazing places. But we can go out and play or work, and then after you play, you want to clean. So make sure you clean your boots and ATVs, gear, anything that's been in been used, and then you go to the next place. And so this is something that ties pretty closely into the clean, inspect, seal that the biosecurity plan of the refuge is starting to implement. So another tool, the Alaska Exotic Plant Inventory Clearinghouse. This is something that Catherine mentioned earlier. This is kind of your one-stop shop to find out what species are present in areas you might be going to. There's a link to the website here, so you can look at this and look at the different islands you're going to. And then something that you might find is there may not be any or very, very little data for the islands you're going to. So that's part of the reason that we're talking to you guys today, is that you'll be out there and you can help us be the eyes and ears on the ground. And if you do find one of these things, you can take the information of the location and a few other different pieces of data that'll be very helpful, and then send that in to me. And at the end of the year, I compile everything for all of the refuges in the zone south of the Alaska range, and then I upload it to this website. And so you can help us help create content on this website that's very useful for us, and then for anybody in the public that wants to find out kind of what invasive species are growing and where. And so something that Catherine mentioned earlier is that there are multiple ways to preserve specimens, which is something that you guys might want to do. So if there's something that you think looks pretty close to one of the the plants in the presentation today. You can take a sample of it and then use a plant press. There are a lot of these that are commercially available through different vendors. That if you want, I can get you more information. Just contact me about how to find one of these, and then also how to use them as well. But when you when you collect, just make sure you that you get as much of the root all the way to the top of the plant as you can. That aids in the folks that are going to be identifying it when you bring it back. And so just a final reminder that prevention is the most effective tool for invasive species management. If we prevent them by implementing processes like the clean, inspect, seal with the Refuge's biosecurity plan, and also the play, clean, go, and then using boot brushes like this at the beginnings and endings of trails, and then also equipment. If you have any kind of equipment like this, any dirt like this, cleaning that, and then critters can help spread it too, as well as watercraft. A bunch of different ways that these species that we talked about can be spread. So just making sure that all of your stuff is clean before you go places will be the biggest help, and that will eliminate a lot of need for a lot of refuge and service effort to be put into controlling a newly established population. So in closing, we just want to thank you guys for helping us keep Alaska wild and free, and and keeping it the great place that it is, and have a great season out on islands. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact us, and we'll be happy to get you more information.
All right, thank you.